Today, Dubrovnik is one of the most visited places on the planet. And for those of you who have been lucky enough to have already seen this incredible walled city, then you'll know why that's the case. But for those of you who haven't yet been to Dubrovnik, then it's a destination that you really do have to have on your bucket list of places to go. In 1929, George Bernard Shaw summed things up, I think, really pretty well when he turned around and said, and I'll quote him, "If you want to see heaven on earth, then come to Dubrovnik." And I've got to be honest, for one, I'm certainly not going to argue with that. My name's David Burgess, and welcome to this, my very first Viking.TV presentation. Now, since 2015, I've been presenting lectures for Viking Ocean Cruises, covering the history and the culture on some of the most amazing places our world has to offer. Now, I've always loved to travel, and the history that went with it, and I've really got my dad, I think, to thank very much for that. Now, although he didn't know it at the time, he ignited in me a passion for discovery that has never been extinguished. I don't think it ever will. So, for now, I'd like you all to come along on a journey with me as we have a look at the history and the background of a very special place that is indeed Croatia's jewel of the Adriatic, Dubrovnik. It's sometimes quite strange how in your mind how things work, because having just said what I did, memories of my childhood came flooding back to me, especially the ones about going away. You see, back in my childhood, that actually wasn't a Croatia. Well, at least not the Croatia that we know today. And that's because back then the country was actually part of Yugoslavia. This was a time when the UK was going through a boom period and travel companies introduced the package holiday. We couldn't get enough of them in the UK, and for the first time, mass tourism was available to everyone. And the two most popular destinations, mainly I suppose because they both offered a guaranteed abundance of sun and sand, were of course Spain and Yugoslavia. As a result of that, the Adriatic became one of the places to go, and Yugoslavia became a very well-known destination. Now, many a traveller may not have had much of an idea as to what the country's history was before they went there, but most of them, I'm sure, certainly did by the time they came home. After all, the history is everywhere. The history of Dubrovnik is remarkable. It's an independent merchant republic and has been for 700 years, and that only finished because it was abolished by Napoleon in 1806. It traded with Turkey, it traded with India in the east, and the city also had a trade representative in Africa, as they were also based in the Cape Verde Islands. Dubrovnik even had diplomatic relations with the English court in the Middle Ages, and if you go to the city's museum in the old town of Dubrovnik, you'll find on display there a letter from Queen Elizabeth I. The city's status was such that even powerful and rich Venice was envious of this Croatian city. But how did Dubrovnik actually get its name? Okay, this all started back in prehistoric times with a small settlement that was built on an island that separated from the mainland by a strip of marshland. This island was called Laos. Not too far away from this settlement, there was a Greek settlement known as Epidaurus. In the 7th century, Epidaurus, the Greek settlement, was invaded and destroyed by the Slavs. The survivors fled to nearby Laos. Now, over a period of time, the name Laos became Raos, which, again, over a period of time, changed to Ragusa, which is the historic name for Dubrovnik. Before that happened, though, the Croats founded a town which they called Dubrovnik. This was way back, though, in 1189, and it's actually the very first recorded use of the name Dubrovnik. It's a name that comes as a direct result of the town's location. Dub means oak. Dubrava means wood. And I'm sure that certainly by now you've probably figured out that the settlement of Dubrovnik was actually built by the side of an oak forest. Between then and the 14th century, the marshland that divided the communities of Ragusa and Dubrovnik filled in, which resulted in them merging together. The name for this new enlarged settlement stayed as Ragusa. Dubrovnik now only became the town's official name after World War I in 1918. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Dubrovnik thrived because of trade. They were, without any shadow of a doubt whatsoever, the undisputed masters of this particular craft. For Dubrovnik, trade was more important than anything. As a city-state, they had very little to absolutely no desire whatsoever to fight. They certainly had no ambitions to be empire builders. For them, trade, especially shipping, was the be-all and end-all. Dubrovnik had a huge fleet of merchant ships that travelled all over the world, forging trade links and founding settlements. You see, one of the keys to its success wasn't conquering, it was trading. Dubrovnik ships always sailed under a white flag with the word freedom written on it. Now, on the face of it, what we today would refer to as staying neutral would seem a fairly straightforward thing to do, but it was far from that back then, and the reason for that was quite simply the Ottomans. You see, the Ottomans weren't known for being particularly friendly people, and Dubrovnik's geographical position was a real issue for them back in those days, owing to its rather close proximity to Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's an area which was then under their occupation and under their control. And then, of course, further along the coast, there was the mighty Venice with its huge ego, its jealousy, and rivalry as a major sea trading port. I think to turn around and say Dubrovnik had trouble keeping the neighbours happy would really be quite an understatement. But Dubrovnik, which back then was an entirely autonomous independent republic, did manage to keep the peace, and it did so through its famed diplomacy. Being friendly with such as the Venetians and the Ottomans, the latter having a particularly unpleasant reputation, even brought Dubrovnik a degree of financial success. Back in 1205, Dalmatia was invaded by Venice using the armies of the forces of the Fourth Crusade. Now, despite the very real friction that existed between Venice and Zadar, it was not so much of an issue in Dubrovnik. And you see, the reason for this is that Dubrovnik was not considered by Venice as actually being a rival to them as a trading nation. But things weren't going to stay that way. Changes were coming. Using force and a complete lack of diplomacy for which Dubrovnik was celebrated, Venice won this battle, after which Dubrovnik was made to become simply a supply base for the Venetians. They also had to pay a set fee to the Venetians, which seemed to grow and grow and grow over time. Finally, Dubrovnik was then turned into a southern Adriatic naval base for Venice. So as far as Venice was concerned, Dubrovnik wasn't even in the same league when it came to being a threat to East-West trade relations. And because of this, Dubrovnik managed to use its diplomatic skill to negotiate and retain a large portion of its original independence. But over time, tensions gradually ran high as Venice imposed stricter and stricter and harsher rules, and the tributes continued to grow in size. And by this time, many of Dubrovnik's politicians were growing tired of paying, and so the plotting began. So despite the political dissatisfaction and the internal plotting, it wasn't until 1358 that Dubrovnik gained full independence from the Venetians, and the entire thing only happened because of the Treaty of Zadar, which forced Venice to abandon all of its claim to Dalmatia and withdraw all of its forces. Venice left in double quick time. Now there was a problem. Dubrovnik needed a friend. Dubrovnik needed an ally. And one nation actually answered the call. That nation was Hungary, who, over time, was to become a more than valuable friend during these particular times. Dubrovnik then went on to accept the leadership of King Louis I, under the condition that it was more of a I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine kind of thing. Visegrad oversaw the agreement, which was then signed and sealed, after which Dubrovnik recognised the sovereignty of Hungary. This unexpected ally also came with a few bonuses, owing to the fact that the Kingdom of Hungary was by no means a naval power, meaning much less conflict of interest and general friction took place than when compared, say, to Dubrovnik's experiences that they'd only just had with Venice. And Dubrovnik, owing to the mild ways of King Louis I, was all but left to its own devices. Over time, it gradually claimed more territory, crawling all the way up to Pelzak, as well as down to Konailf in the south. The autonomous Dubrovnik Republic and the Kingdom of Hungary got along like a house on fire when compared to the terrible relationship with the Venetians, and the connection was actually far from a sour one. But the disaster happened when the Ottomans showed up. The Ottomans as a nation weren't known for being the friendliest of people, and to be fair, they certainly didn't do things by halves. They really didn't care if you were weak or strong. They simply conquered everything and everyone by sheer force. And as such, it was entirely expected that Dubrovnik's days as a republic were well and truly over. In 1458, Dubrovnik signed a treaty with the Ottomans, officially rendering it as a tributary to the Sultan. This tribute had to be paid on the 1st of November every year via an ambassador directly to Constantinople. This put Dubrovnik in a position that was every bit as unenviable and unfavourable that they had found itself in with Venice not that long ago. And as just been mentioned, the Ottomans were not the type of people that you'd upset. But Dubrovnik, quite clever, they had an ace up their sleeve. They had highly skilled negotiators and talented and experienced diplomats who were both modern-minded and forward-thinking. After the negotiations, Dubrovnik looked after all of the trade on the Adriatic for the Ottomans, and with that came many social and economic benefits, including tax exemptions for the city's merchants, customs duty cuts, the ability to trade in places that were otherwise off limits to non-Ottoman traders. For example, they could trade in the Black Sea, but nobody else could. Dubrovnik, because of all of this, were now in quite a good position because they were now protected, at least trade-wise, by the Ottoman Empire. But protection was not cheap, and the Ottomans were demanding more money for providing this service. So after sealing the deal, Dubrovnik were then free to make treaties with other powers that shared the same economic goals as the empire. And in exchange for, well, relative independence, plus the protection of the then almighty Ottomans, in the end, the powers in Dubrovnik decided that the price being demanded was actually a price that was worth paying. The Ottomans viewed Dubrovnik as a port of enormous significance to their own goals. As for Dubrovnik, they were protected entirely by the Ottoman Empire, especially when it came to potential problems with the likes of Venice, which was growing increasingly uncomfortable with Dubrovnik's success. The 15th century saw Dubrovnik become one of Venice's main rivals alongside other European nations such as England. But things still went wrong, and things really went pear-shaped in 1537. Back then, a Venetian ship was carrying letters from Venice to be delivered to the Count of Couture. From there, these letters were to be sent on to Venetian ambassadors in Constantinople. Due to bad weather, the ship had to make port in Salerno. Now, because of this potential delay in delivering the letters, the ship's captain decided that the best thing to do would be to send the letters onwards overland by messenger. Now, at this time, a Dubrovnik nobleman, whose name was Peter Pukic, was engaged as a spy by the French. And he actually arranged for the messenger to be attacked and for the letters to be stolen. The attack happened as planned, and the letters, which were in code, were sent on to the French, who not only deciphered and read the letters, but then passed their contents on to the Ottomans. The rulers of Dubrovnik had now found out what had happened, and they immediately sent a messenger to get the letters back and deliver them to Kotor themselves. Dubrovnik also knew it had been one of their own nobles that had betrayed them, and as such, they had no other option other than to offer what in truth must have been quite a grovelling apology to Venice. Venice, though, didn't take this in any way, shape or form, and in revenge, they actually seized Dubrovnik ships carrying much needed grain to the city. There was a bit more to this, though, than at first seems to be the case, because Venice was motivated by more than just revenge. Turkish troops had captured the island of Corfu the previous September, and the rulers of Venice were now, albeit quite reluctantly, making preparations to actually enter into an alliance with Christian powers against the Ottoman Empire. They also had to ensure that a neutral Dubrovnik didn't benefit from this at the expense of Venice. So, as a result of this, the Venetian government ordered the seizure of all Dubrovnik ships headed towards Turkish ports. A Venetian fleet then set sail to enforce this strict blockade. Venice now really started to turn the screws on Dubrovnik as they exerted very strong pressure on Rome to make Dubrovnik join the Holy League against the Ottoman Empire. This, as I'm sure you know by now, this went against everything Dubrovnik stood for, and their non-membership of the Holy League already had the full understanding of the Vatican. But in reality, perceived power and actual power are two very different things. And on this occasion, the Pope had very little power when it came down to it. And this was mainly because the papal navy sailing in the Adriatic was doing so in name only. In reality, it was the Venetian navy sailing under the papal flag. That was an arrangement the Pope was not going to jeopardize for anyone or anything, and that included Dubrovnik. In 1538, as a show of strength, the Venetian fleet on the way to Levant attacked and plundered the Dubrovnik island of Lopud. They sacked the town and took numerous islanders hostage before sailing away. Dubrovnik complained bitterly to the Pope about this attack, saying that even the Turks were better behaved than the Venetians. The islands, who had not been taken hostages, had simply nowhere to go. Their homes had been destroyed, and as a result of this, Dubrovnik was flooded with refugees. Let's not forget, this was a time when Dubrovnik's grain ships were already blockaded, meaning there actually wasn't enough food for the existing population, let alone enough food for any additional people or those that were pouring into the town itself. All the rulers of Dubrovnik could do was to send the refugees and their families up into the surrounding hills and basically tell them to fend for themselves. There was a further escalation in the autumn of 1538 when the Turks lost Herek Novi in modern-day Montenegro. They lost this to Admiral Andrea Doria and the European Christian fleet. Dubrovnik then did two things. First of all, they sent a message of condolence regarding this loss to the Turks, and at the very same time agreed to lend 10,000 ducats to the victorious admiral. Now, Admiral Doria actually made it very clear to Dubrovnik that this loan was more a favour he was calling in, as both he and the governor of Naples had blocked a Venetian proposal for Dubrovnik to be attacked instead of Herceg-Novi. And as is the way with many of these things, a year later, in 1539, and with no doubt much relief to Dubrovnik, the Turks retook Herceg-Novi. Dubrovnik sent their congratulations and 1,000 ducats as well. Now, the main problem at this time was that the Turks could not protect Dubrovnik from Venice, whose ships continued to blockade the city, which was facing real starvation. In 1540, one ship managed to slip through this blockade. It was only when the Venetians sought peace with the Turks that any leverage was put on Venice as a part of the peace agreement was the removal of the blockade by the Venetians and a guarantee of free passage for all of their ships in the future. Now, it looked as though things finally would start to get better for Dubrovnik. And they did, and for the next 30 years. So despite a continuous war between Turkey and Spain, Dubrovnik was left alone. Even Venice at that particular time had no appetite to get involved in the conflict. Now, at this particular point, I'm just going to move forward to the mid-17th century. But first, I just need to give you some background to the local geography in this part of the world. So, Dubrovnik and southern Dalmatia are subject to seismic conditions that are both dangerous and complicated, and the complications actually add to the danger. The coastal strip here has been sinking for centuries, but not at the same rate or at the same time or even in the same direction. And I'm sure you can appreciate when I say that this is not really the time to go into the reasons why this is the case. All we really need to know is that all of this unpredictable movement has resulted in some very strong and destructive seismic activity, followed by phases of relative stability. As I just mentioned, these particular phases are difficult to interpret, let alone predict. Now, the first recorded earthquake in Dubrovnik was in the 15th century, but there really is no reason whatsoever to think that there weren't others before then. But from 1430, Dubrovnik suffered from a series of tremors plus 11 serious earthquakes. We know, because of city records, that there was a quake on the 28th of October 1496. There was another in 1497, which destroyed a number of houses. Another quake hit the city on the 17th of May 1520, which was more severe, killing several dozen people. Numerous houses were also demolished in that one. It was described at the time as being not so much an earthquake, but more a punishment from God. So, in order to appease God, they built the Church of St. Saviour in the hope that it would protect them from future earthquakes and other natural disasters. But not even the Church of St. Saviour could help them, as on the 6th of April 1667, on Holy Wednesday just before Easter, between 8 and 9 in the morning, Dubrovnik was affected by the most dramatic effect in all of its history. Witnesses give almost identical descriptions of what took place. There was a brief but strong shake from the underground. It was short-lived, yet it made Dubrovnik begin to crumble. In just a few seconds, the city of luxurious Gothic and Renaissance palaces, churches, monasteries, and many other buildings was transformed into a sad ruin, filled with the cries of the survivors who were left covered with rocks and wooden beams. Everything in the city was falling apart. Everything was shaking. The walls were shifted sideways and then fell back to place. Huge rocks broke from the Surd Hill, rolling down and destroying everything in their path. Holes in the ground opened up and engulfed the houses. The dust rose up into the sky and blotted out the sun, whose light looked as red as blood. Water supplies were interrupted. The wells dried up or were filled with yellow mud. The apocalyptic atmosphere was completed with the scenes at sea, where thunder as from lightning of cannons could be heard. Soon enough, Dubrovnik was actually swept by a tidal wave. As the sea retreated, the ships anchored in the harbour were left with broken keels torn against the rocks. Soon the sea returned, with high waves sinking all of the ships. Now, when Dubrovnik's catastrophe was complete, the survivors were able to take stock of what had happened. Such was the devastation, 3,000 people lost their lives during the earthquake. The casualty list included the rector and half of the members of the Great Council. Half of the nobility lost their lives. And it's also interesting to think that a year before this particular earthquake, the plague had also claimed 1,000 lives in the city. But the real problems were yet to arrive. The city continued due to aftershocks to shake for the next week. At the same time, a fire broke out which ravaged the city. The fire blazed on for 20 days, being continuously fanned by strong winds. The survivors took refuge in the Revelin fortress and the lazaretto. Now, strangely enough, neither of those two were actually damaged at all. Thousands of wounded were left in ruins. They were crying out for help. There was total and utter chaos. Hardly anyone was in a position to offer help to those still trapped and buried in the ruins. But even in this complete disarray, several of Dubrovnik's nobles actually managed to retain calm and composure. At that time, they founded the Council of the 12 that brought the key decisions in the days after the earthquake. It was decided that everyone who had left the town in this difficult time actually was going to be punished. Now, the reason being that as far as they were concerned, it was considered to be their duty to stay and actually help and rebuild the city. They paid 800 people to protect the city from possible attacks by the Turks or Venetians, as well as to act as a de facto police force. Even in those most difficult of times of Dubrovnik's history, diplomacy played a key role, especially that of Stefan Craddock, a diplomat in the Vatican. It was he who probably worked harder than anybody else in order to see his hometown soar again to the former prosperity. He particularly emphasized that Dubrovnik really had to rely on its own resources in the reconstruction. His notes on the reconstruction of the city are actually kept today in the Franciscan monastery. And his contribution to all of this was so great that he was honored by the people of Dubrovnik, who erected a memorial plaque on the newly built Baroque cathedral in his honor, the old cathedral having been completely destroyed. Now, regardless of the terrible earthquake, Dubrovnik managed to hold on and begin a new phase of its history. It had been one of Europe's biggest earthquakes of all time. The ultimate microseismical waves were actually felt as far away as Venice, Naples, Constantinople, and even in Egypt, to a distance of 1,000 miles, covering an area of some 12 million square kilometers. Now, here's a side note for you. Do you remember the church I mentioned a short while ago, the Church of St. Saviour, the one that was built to protect Dubrovnik from earthquakes? Well, it clearly failed in that regard, but strangely enough, it was one of the few buildings that actually remained completely intact, along with the Revelin Fortress, Sponza Palace, and the Lazaretto. Incidentally, the Revelin was the first fort to be built outside of Dubrovnik city walls. It got its name from the word Revelin, which means a building by the coast. The fort itself was actually built during the 16th century, following the drawings of an Italian engineer by the name of Anto Bergamasco. The Dubrovnik Republic decided to build the fort in order to better protect the city from the threat of the Venetians. Revelin itself is the city's largest fortress. It's built with very thick walls, which neither earthquakes or wars have been able to destroy. And it's often been used as a vital shelter during many parts of the city's history. So following the great earthquake and until the reconstruction of the city, the leaders of Dubrovnik worked from Revelin. They transferred the state treasury there as well as that of the cathedral to prevent them from being looted. Problems for the Revelin started though after the fall of the Dubrovnik Republic. The Austrians, who were there at the time, actually left the fort in quite a mess. Inside the fortress themselves, they had added mezzanine floors and used the space as a barracks. Around the fortress, they had dug a deep ditch and made a road that is actually still in use today. In the 20th century, Rivlin tried to adapt to some modern needs in the years that followed. And some of these adaptations were welcomed, others not so much and weren't allowed. Today, it's actually the home of a very popular nightclub. But just thinking back for a moment, I did mention that thousands of people lost their lives as a result of the plague, which came before the earthquake. So, as it's also an important point in the history of the city, I'll just give you a little bit of background to that. So in the Middle Ages, Asia and Europe were devastated by outbreaks of incurable diseases from plague to malaria. And due to the maritime trade, Dubrovnik wasn't spared from these epidemics. And in 1527, the plague in one foul swoop took as many as 1,000 lives. Now, there was a barber by the name of Andrea, who was thought to have brought the plague from Ancona into Dubrovnik. He was tortured and he was ordered to be tied to a cart and then dragged around the city. Yes, very Game of Thrones. Epidemics had broken out earlier than this in Dubrovnik. In 1377, Dubrovnik issued a decree according anyone who lived abroad to spend 40 days in one of the nearby islands before entering the city. This was the first such decision ever taken in the world, and it's now considered that the idea of quarantine, which is what it was originally a Dubrovnik idea. And then, only when it was proven that a person was healthy would they be released from quarantine and could go back to the city. Now, the area where the infected people lived, known as Dance, was surrounded by high walls, so they couldn't escape. Eventually, the space at Dance became too small, so in 1627 it was decided to build a new quarantine, Lazarati, at the east entrance to the city. Here, people would have to stay before being allowed to enter the city itself. Just how much they were afraid of an epidemic is best illustrated by the fact, if you like, that during an epidemic of disease, the leaders of the city fled to Zaton, leaving 10 nobles to manage Dubrovnik. Now, those leaders who fled may actually have made a really good decision for themselves. Because of the 10 nobles they left behind, 9 died. And it's also interesting that the people of Dubrovnik at the time thought that the plague could be treated with vinegar and sour milk. They believed that sour milk would actually ease the pain and that pathogens can't survive in vinegar. Overall, Dubrovnik was ravaged by more than 50 epidemics that killed over 100,000 people. And if not for the Lazareti, the figure surely would have been considerably worse. Now, as we did before, we're just going to move forward very slightly because we're going to move forward now to 1814. This was a time in local history that is known as the Siege of Dubrovnik. So the Siege of Ragusa, or the Siege of Dubrovnik, was fought between local Ragusan insurgents as well as Austrian Croat troops and the British Royal Navy under the command of Captain William Horst against a French garrison under Joseph de Machinard between the 19th and the 27th of January 1814 during the Adriatic campaign of the Napoleonic Wars. The siege itself was fought on the coast of the Adriatic Sea for possession of the strategically important fortified town of Dubrovnik. On the 27th of May, 1806, the forces of the Empire of France occupied the neutral Republic of Ragusa. So when they entered Ragusan territory without permission and approached the capital, the French General Jacques Lauriston demanded that his troops be allowed to rest and be provided with food and drink in the city before continuing on to take possession of their holdings in the Bay of Kotor. However, all of this was a hoax. It was a complete and utter deception, because as soon as they entered the city, They then went and proceeded to occupy it in the name of Napoleon. Almost immediately after the beginning of the French occupation, Russian, Mongolian troops entered Dubrovnik territory and began fighting the French army, whilst at the same time raiding and pillaging everything along the way, which ended up in the siege of Dubrovnik. So throughout the siege, some 3,000 cannonballs fell on the city. In 1808, Marshal Marmont issued a proclamation abolishing the Republic of Ragusa and amalgamating its territories into the French Empire's client state, the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy. Marmont himself actually claimed the newly created title of Duke of Ragusa, and in 1810, Ragusa, together with Istria and Dalmatia, went to the newly created French Illyrian provinces. So after 7 years of French occupation, encouraged by the desertion of French soldiers after the failed invasion of Russia and the re-entry of Austria in the War of August 1813, the people of Dubrovnik rose up in a general insurrection against the Napoleonic invaders. On the 18th of June 1813, together with the help of British forces, they forced the surrender of the French garrison on the island of Sipan, soon followed by the heavily fortified towns of Ston and the island of Lopud, after which the insurrection spread throughout the mainland. The Austrian Empire sent an army offering to help the Ragusan allies. However, as war soon shows, their intention was in fact to replace the French occupation of Ragusa with one of their own, once the French garrison, of course, of 500 troops had surrendered. At this time, the French had less than 600 men left in the entire region after losing over a third of their men due to defection since the war with Austria had started. Eventually, this all became too much for the French, and they'd been cut off for 4 months. As I just mentioned, losing so many troops through defection. They had also suffered a revolt in the surrounding region 3 months earlier, and riots inside the town also flared up. The French then decided that they quite simply had no other option. Their only option was to surrender. The French sent out a messenger offering a truce and to request the British batteries to cease fire. The British agreed, and the siege of Ragusa was over. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Ragusa was made a part of the crown land of the Kingdom of Dalmatia, ruled by Austria-Hungary, known as the Habsburg Empire, which it remained a part of until 1918. It was at this time that Dubrovnik began to develop its tourist industry in the late 19th century. Luminaries such as Lord Byron, George Bernard Shaw, Agatha Christie were in awe of the town, and Dubrovnik began developing its tourist business. But with the outbreak of World War II, Dubrovnik and the rest of Croatia fell under the control of the Axis powers. Italian forces occupied Dubrovnik from 1941 to 1943, at which point the city was passed over to the Germans. Marshal Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans formed the only effective resistance to German occupation, and the city itself was liberated in 1944. But moving forward again, in December 1991, the world watched in horror as Serbian and Montenegrin gunners trained their artillery on the beautiful historic city of Dubrovnik. As it was without military value, the only purpose seemed to be to break the morale of the Croatian people by destroying the Adriatic's most historic city. The shelling of 1991 lasted intermittently until June 1992, and it caused substantial damage to the roofs, the marble streets, and the Renaissance sculptures. But that point in Dubrovnik's history is actually so recent, and for many still a very real memory, that any talk about Dubrovnik really wouldn't be complete without including this part in its history. The war in former Yugoslavia was waged at the beginning of the 1990s and lasted until the mid-1990s. See, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the former East European communist countries became democratic, and such was the case in former Yugoslavia as well. But parallel with this transition, the role of the local politician Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia-Montenegro. Milosevic manages to rally the generals of the Yugoslav army, who were predominantly of Serbian ethnicity, and he launched an aggression against Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. His plan was to occupy as many areas and establish a greater Serbia. In former Yugoslavia, because of tourism, there actually wasn't a Yugoslav army in Dubrovnik. And at the beginning of the war in Dubrovnik, there actually wasn't any fighting at all. However, Montenegrin politicians spread panic in Montenegro through the media. They spread panic by turning around and saying that the Croatian army was gathering in Dubrovnik and they were preparing to attack Montenegro. They armed their population, and under the pretext that the Croats will attack them, together with Serbs from Eastern Herzegovina, prepare an attack on Dubrovnik. The war in Dubrovnik began on the 1st of October 1991 with aerial attacks. Yugoslav army aircraft bombed the strategic goals: water, power lines, telecommunications, and Dubrovnik was immediately left without electricity and without water, and the city would remain that way for months. The Croatian army in Dubrovnik area was poorly armed, so the Serbs and Montenegrins had no trouble advancing. They quickly occupied the entire surrounding areas. Now, the only place that is not occupied is Serd Hill, where today the War Museum is situated, and the Austro-Hungarian fortress is also there. Serbs and Montenegrins continuously bombarded the city, including the old town, under UNESCO protection. Onofiro's fountain, the Sponza Palace, the bell tower, the Franciscan monastery, the Church of St. Ignatius, all were hit. In fact, it's actually probably a lot easier to turn around and say which of the cultural attractions of the city were not hit than to say, in fact, which ones were. The biggest attack happened on the 6th of December 1991, when Serbs and Montenegrins decided to take the town. Starting at dawn, the city was bombarded from all sides. The shells are actually falling on the old town and hitting the cultural monuments. It's in flames. Churches and palaces are burning, including the old city harbour as well as the hotels. On that day alone, more than 2,000 shells fell on Dubrovnik's old town. 1/3 of the city's cultural buildings, its historic monuments, all priceless and each historically important in its own right, all were randomly and indiscriminately attacked. All were badly damaged. This was the fiercest attack in the history of the old town of Dubrovnik. There was close quarter combat up on Serd Hill going on all day, but the Croatian army somehow actually manages to stop the attack. In early 1992, the Serbs and Montenegrins try to take the city again, but by this time, the Croatian army is better prepared and stronger, and successfully resists the attacks. They liberated much of the surrounding areas of Dubrovnik, meaning that after that, the city had a somewhat normal life again. But later that year, Dubrovnik experienced sporadic attacks. The worst occurred in the summer of 1995, when the Serbs fired a shell on a beach at Zaton where people were swimming. 3 people were killed, with many more wounded. Overall, some 2,127 houses were completely destroyed, leaving 7,700 residents homeless. But after the fighting ended, teams of skilled workers laboured throughout most of the 1990s, and now the treasures of Dubrovnik are beautifully restored. So, having said that, this seems to be the ideal time to discuss some of these amazing buildings that we've been talking about. some of these incredible monuments that make up the stunning old town of Dubrovnik. So I think what we'll do, let's have a closer look at some of these great buildings. In 1385, the Grand Chamber decided to build a city clock tower, and 5 years later, the first tick and the first tock was heard. Of course, I have to point out at this point, it really isn't the same bell tower that stands there today, which is relatively new, having only been built in the mid-15th century. And so, Dubrovnik unveiled its city clock just 54 years after the very first public clock was built in Europe in Milan. But, and this was important to the people of Dubrovnik, they unveiled their clock 50 years before Venice. Not only that, but the Dubrovnik Zelenci, which is the bell-striking figures on the tower, were made some 21 years before the famous Venetian Moors. So, the Zelenci, who bear traditional Dubrovnik names of Maro and Barrow, are Roman soldiers covered in a green patina, which is how they got their second name. They are also known quite simply as the Greens. The really sad thing about all this, though, is that nobody actually knows who made them because there is no written documentation. And we have to say, this really is quite strange, simply because the locals back in the day documented everything. But what they didn't do was document the making of Maro and Barrow. And so they have become one of the few mysteries in the history of Dubrovnik. But we do know who made the massive bell that Maro and Barrow strike. The bell, which weighs more than 2 tons, was made by Ivan Rablician. As we've mentioned, Dubrovnik is the most active seismic area in Croatia and is frequently hit by earthquakes. At the beginning of the 19th century, due to multiple earthquakes which Dubrovnik suffered, the bell tower began to lean towards the Straden. Attempts were made to fix it, but in the end it was completely demolished in 1928. Fortunately for the city, they had a wealthy benefactor, a Dubrovnik immigrant by the name of Pasko Barica, and he financed the reconstruction of a new Renaissance-style bell tower, complete with all of its Gothic elements. However, after the restoration, the original greens were not returned to the tower. Instead, they were used to make faithful replicas which have been striking the bell and telling the time from that day until this. The original Maro and Barrow, if you want to see them, you certainly can do, because they are now in the Cultural History Museum in the Rector's Palace, where this masterpiece of Renaissance sculpture is on public display. Ivan Rabelician's original bell tower, or the original bell, was hung in the bell tower. But it was after the restoration that locals claimed that now, for some reason, the bell tower isn't as loud as it was before, when the bell could be heard as far away as Gros Harbour. But as magnificent as the bell tower is, one of the main attractions of the old town are its walls. Indeed, Dubrovnik city walls are one of the best maintained fortified constructions anywhere in the world. Construction began on the first wall sections very early back in the 8th century, but the larger sections were built much later in the 15th and the 16th century, and it's mainly these walls that we can actually see today. So well built were the walls that the great earthquake of 1667 barely damaged them at all. The walls are some 1,940 meters long. They're 25 meters high, 4 to 6 meters thick on the land-facing side, and 1.5 to 3 meters thick on the sea-facing side. They are protected by towers on all 4 sides. Beneath the walls, there is a large deep ditch, which unfortunately really isn't visible today because of the road and the car park subsequently built. But back in the day, it was this ditch that helped to further fortify the city, along with 120 cannons. Throughout history, it had been the Venetians that the locals here feared the most of all. And because of that, at the end of the 14th century, it was decreed that all private buildings and churches outside the walls would be knocked down in order to stop them being occupied as strategic positions by enemy forces, Venetians or otherwise. And it's interesting that despite the breathtaking beauty of these walls, the builders weren't concerned with aesthetics at all. All they were concerned with was the efficiency in protecting the city. In the end, though, I think we can all agree, they fulfilled both criteria, although some parts were actually built in haste. After all, Venice is only just along the coast. So when the walls were finished, visitors were able to describe their feelings at seeing them. Conrad von Gutenberg from Konstanz wrote at the end of the 15th century that Dubrovnik was one of the most beautiful cities in the world and one of the best protected by its walls. He said, Dubrovnik is so fortified a city, there is no such place anywhere in the world that could defeat them. The city's powerful fortresses, its towers, 2 deep trenches between them and the outer sleeve, the strong walls and their battlements are all built from carved stone. And there is a saying, there's an old saying that says that he who visits Rome and doesn't see either the Pope or at least the Vatican simply shouldn't have bothered going there in the first place. Now the same goes for Dubrovnik's walls, because in Dubrovnik they turn around and say that he who comes to Dubrovnik and doesn't visit the walls has missed out on quite a lot. So whatever you do, please don't miss out. So I think all of that proves, without any shadow of a doubt, that Dubrovnik really is the pearl of the Adriatic. And I have absolutely no doubt that when you have visited the city for yourself, that you will feel that way about it as well. There is one thing for sure though, you'll never want to visit Dubrovnik just once. So for now, I'll leave you with Dubrovnik.